like that measure personally. I don't think it's a useful measure, particularly when we're looking at athletes, because that's a one number. It's not related to your body size or, right? So for an average person on a 2,000 calorie diet or whatever the RDAs are based on, they recommend that 300 grams is carbohydrate. Well, that's not very useful when we're trying to be specific for different athletes. All right? So we'll come back to that idea in a minute. Carbohydrate is our preferred energy source for aerobic activity. So given the opportunity, your body will use carbohydrate as much as it can. I can make ATP way more quickly. Remember, carbohydrate is a small molecule compared to a fat or a protein. Right? So it's much easier to break it down and create ATP if I'm burning carbohydrate than if I'm trying to use fats. Right? So that allows for a faster, sustainable pace as long as I've got carbohydrate available, and that's the kicker. Okay? So also I don't need as much oxygen because I make more ATP for the same amount of oxygen. So it's very beneficial if I'm running, biking, hiking, to use some carbohydrate as an energy source. Right? Where's my notes? Okay. So if we have prolonged aerobic exercise, it's not going to be anaerobic if it's prolonged. Right? And I can't keep up anaerobic exercise for very long. So if it's going to be prolonged, then we start to use liver glycogen as well as our muscle glycogen. So first off, you've got glycogen stored in that muscle tissue. It's going to use that immediate storage form. It's going to take blood glucose out of the bloodstream, and you've got a readily available source of carbohydrate to make ATP. If you keep going for long enough and your muscle glycogen is dropping down, then the storage in your liver starts to dump glucose into the bloodstream, which can be carried around to the muscle and used for ATP. Right? So, for example, after about an hour of high-intensity aerobic work, so if I'm running at 85–90% VO2 max, not me personally, because I would not do that, that would be very uncomfortable. But if you look at, I mean, imagine running 26 miles in just over 2 hours, right? They are not jogging. Some of us can't even sprint as fast as they run aerobically, right? People who run marathons very quickly are super well adapted to running marathons. They're not typical people. So if I'm running at a high intensity but low enough to stay aerobic, for a prolonged period of time I'm going to use this liver glycogen. After about an hour, I've probably depleted my liver glycogen and my muscle glycogen by about 55%. The jump to 2 hours is quite dramatic because by 2 hours, I'm pretty much out of glycogen. Okay? So, unless I'm able to switch to fats earlier, or unless I carb load, right, I have to find a way to protect that storage form of glycogen, otherwise by 2 hours I'm done. So if you talk to people who run marathons, they'll often say, oh, I was going really, really well, and I only had a couple of miles to go, and all of a sudden I felt like I was running backwards. I got so slow, right? And we slow down because we don't have enough carbohydrate now to make ATP fast enough. We have to rely totally on fat, and that takes a long time to make ATP. Hitting the wall when we're running is running out of glycogen. Right? So when athletes say, I hit the wall, that means they ran out of glycogen, right? Everything starts to slow down, I can't move as fast, my legs feel really wobbly. Okay. So glycogen depletion then is linked to this idea of fatigue. Fatigue physiologically means I'm losing power. So I start to slow down as I'm running or biking. But you'll also see a link to fatigue, mental fatigue, because I start to feel tired when my glycogen stores are running out as well. So it impacts me mentally as well as physically. My legs start to feel heavy, that's a little demotivating. Right? So there's all these subtle kind of attacks on your mentality as well. Don't forget though that carbs are also an important source for anaerobic exercise if I am using the glycolytic system. So system 1, the question at the beginning of the class, carb loading doesn't help high power events because high power events use system 1. Right? System 1 uses which molecules to create ATP? I already have ATP in the muscle, so that's about 5 seconds. What's the other molecule in system 1?
Oh, phosphate.
Phosphocreatine, right? So there's no need for any glucose, carbohydrate, if I'm using system 1. So carb loading, if I'm using system 1 for my event, wouldn't do any good because I don't need carbs. Okay. Creatine loading, it's a different kettle of fish, that might be. So, but if I'm working the glycolytic system, then glycogen, carbohydrate stores become very important in that exercise. So if I do 1 minute fast, high intensity cycle bouts, muscle glycogen drops down about 72%, right? If I do resistance work, then resistance work that is old-fashioned type weight training, right? Might use system 1, depends how many reps you do if you're going to get in system 2. But if you're doing circuit work or these high-intensity type resistance programs where you're doing squats followed by press-ups followed by abs or whatever combination you put those into where you're not taking a break, you want to be working more glycolytically. Right? So we see glycogen depletion in those kinds of exercises, particularly in our type 2A fibers, because they're the ones doing a lot of the work in that kind of exercise. So this graph just gives you an idea of what's happening in the muscle here. All right. So the blue line is a high carb diet, and in this particular piece of research data, it was very high, 70%. So remember, the recommended range is only up to 65. So this is a super high carb diet. All right. And a low carb diet is the red line. So below the other end of the range, 40%. So again, a very low carb diet. And what you see, so on the y-axis, you have muscle glycogen levels. And here we have time. So if I do my first training bout, my muscle glycogen stores were nice and high at the beginning of the training bout. I train, and glycogen drops down during the training session. But it's pretty easy to put glycogen back into storage. Doesn't take very much. If I have a nice big jacket potato or a big bowl of pasta or rice, good night's sleep, then we're doing pretty well by the next day, right? So I can rebuild on the high. If you look on the high one, we eat enough carbohydrate to basically replenish the store. So the next day, we do our next training bout, we feel good, we feel strong, and we're ready to go again. If, however, we're on the low-carb diet, then by the next day, we haven't put very much glycogen back into storage. So the next day is going to be a little bit harder than the first day. And we see this ongoing pattern. If I eat plenty of carbohydrates, muscle glycogen replenishes every day. And so we've got plenty of store there to make ATP for the next session the next day. If I'm on a low-carb diet for whatever reason, then we find that we don't replenish, and eventually we're getting really, really low. This day here, it's going to be pretty hard. The next day is going to get harder, and our legs. So some days you get up in the morning and your legs feel like little springs, right? And everything's kind of easy and bouncy. And then you get up and you get out of bed and you're like, oh, my legs feel like so heavy, like they put on 15 pounds a leg, okay? The day that your legs feel very heavy, it's always worthwhile going back to the previous day. What did I eat that day? Because that feeling of heaviness can be a lack of muscle glycogen. So it's just, I just like that picture. My sister is diabetic. She just tried a new diabetic diet because she doesn't want to have to take her meds. So she was all gung-ho on this diet. She did about 3 days and she's like, I am so tired. Oh yeah, right? You're not eating enough carbs. I'm sorry, I know that carbs and diabetes are a bit of a problem, but not eating carbs I don't think is the answer. I don't know. As I say, it's not my area of research. So I could be wrong there, but it's not surprising to me that she felt a bit icky after a few days. So for athletes, most athletes who are in training, somewhere around 50%, maybe a little bit more, should be adequate. If I'm a strength athlete, I might need somewhere closer to 55 or 60% at times, especially if I'm in a high intensity phase in the training program. So if I'm a bodybuilder, I probably don't need 60% carbs all the time because we're cycling the training up and down, right? But in a high intensity phase, we need a bit more carb. For endurance athletes, they need the most. They probably need a good 65% because they're doing so much work on a daily basis, and we've got to put that back. If I don't eat enough carbs, then one of the things that tends to happen is I can't keep up the intensity level, or I can't finish the whole training session. So I have my training log set out. This day I'm going to do this day I'm going to do this. And I get to day 2 or day 3 and I'm really struggling to get through the whole training session. Okay? That could be an indication that I didn't have quite enough carbohydrates. You might start to lose muscle mass because I need carbs in order to use protein to build muscle. Hence the carb protein supplement after training. Right? So if I don't have the carbohydrate available, I'm not as well able to utilize protein to build muscle or even maintain muscle because I have to fix it every day when I've trained hard and wrecked it. And we might not see the adaptations that we're expecting from the training program given how hard we're trying to work and the way the program is set out. Right? So when you're looking at eating carbs what do we want to do? Because Coca-Cola is carbohydrate, right? Twinkies are carbohydrate. Grapes are carbohydrate, right? So what carbohydrate do I eat? Is it okay? Does it matter, right? Can I just take in carbohydrate, or does it matter what kinds of carbohydrate we make the choice of? So when we're looking at health overall, actually, if you look at the health literature, the discussion is the same. So whether I'm looking at trying to be healthy, whether I'm looking at trying to be the best athlete I can be, it's better to pick complex carbohydrates. So complex carbs take longer to absorb, right? So things like grains, vegetables, fruits that have more fiber in them. Grapes aren't great as a complex carb. Grapes are more a simple carb. Bananas are more a complex carb. Okay? So, eat the orange, eat the apple, don't drink the apple juice and the orange juice because the fiber's gone away and they act more like a simple carbohydrate than a complex carb. Okay? So complex carbs take longer to break down, and so what you get is a steady drip feed of carbohydrate into your bloodstream. Right? So if we measure your blood glucose levels, then we want to keep our blood glucose as steady as possible. This is where it gets difficult if I'm diabetic, because it's very hard for them to keep their blood sugar level. And that's the key. If I can keep it steady, then I don't have these big swings and troughs. So when I use complex carbs, then what we get is little blips, the main picture of which would be steady blood glucose. Right? We kind of drip feed the bloodstream. That's very useful if I'm an athlete because it means I've got a very steady insulin level. I'm not shifting glucose in and out of the muscles very quickly and getting big drops in blood glucose and getting lightheaded, because that can get me injured. It's good if I'm trying to lose weight, because when we get a big spike in insulin, insulin tends to move the carbohydrate out of the bloodstream very quickly, and if I'm not exercising at that time, I don't need those calories, and then I lay them down as fat instead of as using them as an energy source. Right? So we want to drip feed the bloodstream slowly, and then if I don't need these calories because I'm not working out, I'm much more likely to take this blood glucose and store it as glycogen. Right? What happens when we eat simple carbs, so soda, candy, right, sugars, then what happens is we get a very quick spike in our blood glucose. And if I get a spike in my blood glucose, my response is, here's a ton of insulin dumped into the body. And the insulin's job is to transport the sugar out of the bloodstream into the muscle. Okay? So then about 15, 20, half an hour, depending upon the individual, what happens when you have sugar? About half an hour later, feel a bit sleepy, you crash, Get hungry?
Yes.
Get hungry. Because low blood sugar is the body's stimulator for the appetite response. Right? If my blood sugar is low, your brain says you need to eat something because I want the blood sugar back up here. So it makes you hungry even though you just ate something. Okay? So that's why those crappy breakfast cereals that are full of sugar that parents keep feeding gives me the heebie-jeebies when I walk through Walmart. And they've got all those awful cereals that they're going to feed those children. And then we wonder why the kids can't learn anything in school, because the other thing that happens when my blood sugar is low, your brain needed 130 grams of carbohydrate every day because your brain likes a constant, steady glucose drip to keep it working effectively. So when I have low blood glucose levels, it's really hard to concentrate. Really hard. So I can have a car crash, I can get hurt, I can sit in class and pay absolutely no attention to Dr. Horwitz ring on. Okay? So we don't, that's why I said to you at the beginning of the semester, this is a horrible time for class. Because you don't want to come to class here. You won't learn anything. Right? So you have to bring food with you because your brain needs food in order to function. Okay? So also what we find in the diabetic literature and things is that this picture means that if I've got more glucose than I need, instead of laying it down as glycogen, we tend to store it more as fat, particularly around the viscera. Right? So that trunk type fat. So on this little piece of data, again, just an interesting idea thinking about this sugar. Right? If I'm at rest and I eat sugar, I'm going to get a blood sugar spike, and then I'm going to get a drop. And if I started exercising, that drop can occur quite soon after I started exercising. Right? Because my muscles are going to use that carb to fuel the exercise. So that can be good and bad, depending upon the situation and the person. If I've got a training session coming up and I'm slagging a little bit and I'm feeling a bit ugh, a little jolt of sugar might be just the thing I need to get going. Too much sugar might be just what I need for 20 minutes in for me to go, oh, okay, I'm giving up on this today and going home. If I don't take the sugar, then we see a much more steady blood glucose picture, and we get a little bit longer in the training session before we're exhausted. So it's more effective. I can train a little bit longer. So on this version, I think they corrected this in the new copy of the textbook. On this version, these color indices are the wrong way around. All right, the low carb is not the time to exhaustion up here. This one should be green, and this one should be blue. All right, so if I eat a high carb diet, what we see is longer time before we hit exhaustion in an endurance event. If I eat a low carb diet, we get exhausted earlier. Right? These pieces of information kind of underpin the high glycemic diet idea that some diabetics use. It's a bit complicated. I think it would be better to come up with something that was more user-friendly than the glycemic index. But on a glycemic index, what they do is they measure your blood sugar response to a particular carbohydrate. So, and they categorize foods as either high glycemic, so if your number is 70 or above for that food. So potatoes, oddly, are high glycemic. Apparently they drop glucose into your bloodstream very quickly. And you might see a drop in performance if you eat high glycemic foods ahead of time. They're very handy to have around in case anyone has a diabetic attack. The raisins, candy, things like that. If someone is a type 1 diabetic, they can be useful to have around. Moderate glycemic index foods have a number rating 56 to 69, and low glycemic foods have a number less than 55. So oatmeal is the classic low glycemic food, right? Drip feeds carbohydrate into the bloodstream very slowly. So if you're going to have porridge for breakfast, or you're going to have oats with nuts, right? Oatmeal's a very good way to start the day if you want to keep your blood sugar levels stable. Question. All right, there is a ton of info in this chapter. I'm just trying to summarize it for you. So if we look at carb loading, then carb loading is the idea where I'm trying to increase the glycogen store to its maximum that I'm capable of. If I'm going to run, I want as much glycogen available for that marathon as I possibly can. Right? I don't want to hit the wall. I don't want to be fatigued. I don't want to feel exhausted. I don't want my legs to suddenly wobble. So we want to get as much carbohydrate into the pantry as we can. Right? So, old-fashioned method was a regime where they used to do 1 day depletion. So they worked out really, really hard, tried to get the glycogen stores down as low as possible. And then they had 3 days of not eating very much carbohydrate, but they tried to keep training. And then they had 3 days of really, really high carbohydrate diet with not a lot of training, and then I went and competed. Right? So a 7-day regime leading up to the day of the competition. Well, there were some problems with this. It works very, very well if your goal is high glycogen stores. Right? This works really well. The problem is, as we got more sophisticated with our training techniques and everybody got a little bit closer and just having that edge made a big difference, I had 3 days here where my training was pretty crappy because I didn't have any carbohydrate in my legs, right? And then it gets worse because then I have 3 days where I don't do any training and then I go run a marathon. Well, that's okay if you're just jogging the marathon in 5 hours and you just want to finish. But if you want to win the marathon, do I not train for 3 days before the marathon? Probably not. That might not be the best idea. Right? So this was a problem. So they changed it a bit. They tweaked it. Right? And what they did was, instead of doing this dramatic low to high carb and change in training, they took a slightly simpler approach. And do I have the picture? Yes, here. Okay, so here's the old one, right? Very nice high levels of glycogen at the end of it. Horrible couple of days in here. Right? On the newer version, we stick with our regular diet at the beginning of the week. So I train my regular training, I stick with my regular diet, and then I start increasing my carbohydrate intake, and I don't have to decrease intensity of my training program. So what we get then is a pretty similar picture. It basically works just as well as the old one, but I don't have this really foul athlete to deal with for 3 days in the middle of the week before a big competition, right? So that's very nice for the coaches, it's very nice for the athletes, and if I'm in endurance events that are longer than an hour, bless you.
Bless you.
Anything longer than an hour, then we see that carb loading really does translate into improved performance times, right? If I'm doing something that's less than an hour, so if I'm going to go for a run or I'm going to go speed walk for 3 miles, it's about 42 minutes, then I don't need to carb load. I've got enough carbohydrates stored in my body for 42 minutes. So it's when do I use it, who do I use it with, who is it relevant for? Okay, all right, where are we? All right, we will look at sports drinks on Wednesday. As I said, this chapter has a ton of information. I'm trying to summarize it because there's a lot there. There's way more than I'm talking about, so make sure that you take a good look at it if this is something you're interested in.
Dr. Law.